tower on the 118, Moa, goodbye. Delta 66 via Alpha 2 and Bravo, taxi to runway 09. Upon leaving the apron, first left, first right. Alpha 2, Bravo.
And 189 and 6 tank number to K146 from Riviera.